There is a level of protection that exists beyond what can be seen, measured, or physically explained. It does not rely on walls, systems, or human awareness. It operates quietly, consistently, and with precision. But it is not always fully engaged in every life. This is where the deeper mystery begins. Because many move through life assuming that if something is available, it must automatically be active. But not everything that exists is automatically accessed. Not everything that is available is automatically experienced. And not every level of protection is activated simply by awareness of its existence. This creates a hidden gap, a gap between what is possible and what is experienced, a gap between what is available and what is active. And within that gap, many live without realizing that there is a higher level of covering that has not yet been fully engaged. This is not about fear, it is about awareness. Because the world operates on multiple levels at the same time. There is the visible level, what can be touched, seen, and measured. And then there is the unseen level where influence, direction, and protection often originate before they become visible. Most attention is placed on the visible. Security systems, planning, caution, awareness of surroundings, these are all important. But they only address one layer of reality. And while they can reduce certain risks, they cannot account for everything. There are moments in life where outcomes cannot be explained by visible factors alone. Situations where protection seems to appear unexpectedly. Moments where danger is avoided without clear reason. Times where direction shifts just in time to prevent something unseen. These are not always coincidences. They often reflect the presence of a deeper system of protection that operates beyond human awareness. But here is the critical truth. Presence does not always equal activation. Just because protection exists does not mean it is fully engaged in every situation. Just because covering is available does not mean it is operating at its highest level in every moment. This is where intentionality becomes important, because higher levels of protection are often connected to alignment, awareness, and engagement. They are not random, they are structured, and like any structure, they respond to positioning. This means that how you think, what you focus on, and how you align internally can influence how fully this protection is experienced. This is not about superstition. It is about structure, a system that operates consistently even when it is not visible. And within that system, there are principles that determine access. One of those principles is awareness, because what is not recognized is rarely engaged intentionally. And what is not engaged intentionally often remains underutilized, even if it is fully available. This is why many live below the level of protection that could be active in their lives, not because it is denied, but because it has not been consciously activated. This realization changes perspective. Instead of assuming that everything is random, there is an understanding that alignment plays a role. That awareness creates access. That intention can influence experience in ways that go beyond physical effort alone. And once this awareness begins to develop, something shifts internally. There is a heightened sense of attention, a deeper recognition that life is not only about managing what is seen, but also about aligning with what operates unseen. This creates responsibility, not a heavy burden, but a clear understanding that access is not passive. It requires engagement. It requires intention. It requires a decision to move beyond surface level awareness into deeper alignment with what is already available. And this is where activation begins. Not through fear, not through pressure, but through recognition. Recognition that there is more available than what is currently experienced. Recognition that protection is not limited to physical systems. Recognition that alignment determines how deeply that protection is expressed in daily life. This is the beginning, the moment where awareness replaces assumption, the moment where intention replaces passivity, the moment where what has always been available begins to move closer to being fully activated. And once that process begins, the experience of life itself starts to shift, because protection is no longer something hoped for, but something intentionally aligned with. Beyond the visible structure of life, there exists an unseen system of awareness and response. One that does not rely on physical sight, human monitoring, or technological systems. It operates continuously without interruption, observing movement, direction, and alignment at a level that is not limited by time or space as it is commonly understood. This is what can be described as spiritual surveillance, not in a negative or fearful sense, but in a structured, intentional way. It reflects a dimension where awareness is constant and where response is not random, but connected to alignment, positioning, and internal state. Many people are unfamiliar with this reality, not because it does not exist, but because it is not visible in the same way physical systems are. It does not produce obvious signals. It does not announce itself. It operates quietly, yet effectively, shaping outcomes in ways that often go unnoticed. This is why it is frequently misunderstood. Some may interpret it through fear, while others may dismiss it entirely. But the truth lies in understanding that this system is neither chaotic nor arbitrary. It is ordered. It follows principles. It responds to alignment. And it functions with consistency even when it is not consciously recognized. At its core, spiritual surveillance reflects the idea that nothing moves unnoticed. Not thoughts, not intentions, not direction. Everything exists within a system of awareness that extends beyond physical observation. And within that awareness, there is also response, subtle, precise, and often delayed until the right moment. This changes how life can be understood. Because instead of viewing events as isolated or random, there is a recognition that there are deeper layers influencing direction. That certain outcomes are not simply the result of visible actions, but are also connected to unseen alignment. This is where responsibility begins to take shape. Because if awareness exists at that level, then alignment matters more than it may initially seem. Internal state is not isolated. Thought patterns are not insignificant. Direction is not neutral. Everything contributes to positioning within this system. And positioning influences response. This is not about perfection. It is about awareness. Understanding that life is not only happening externally, but also internally, and that both levels are connected. That what is cultivated within can influence what is experienced externally. This is where many overlook the deeper reality. They focus entirely on visible action while ignoring internal alignment. They invest in external structure without recognizing the importance of internal positioning. And as a result, there can be a disconnect between effort and outcome. But when awareness of this unseen system begins to develop, something shifts. Attention becomes more intentional. Focus becomes more refined. Decisions become more refined. Decisions become more refined. Decisions become more refined. Lined. Because there is an understanding that nothing exists in isolation, that everything operates within a larger framework of awareness and response. This does not create fear. It creates clarity because it reveals that life is not random, that there is order even when it is not immediately visible, that there is structure even when it is not fully understood, and that within this structure, alignment plays a key role in determining how experiences unfold. Spiritual surveillance, in this sense, is not something to be feared or avoided. It is something to be understood and aligned with. It represents a system where awareness is constant and where response is connected to how well one is positioned within that awareness. This is why intentional living becomes important, because when actions, thoughts, and focus are aligned, there is a greater sense of stability. There is less internal conflict. There is more clarity in direction. And over time, this alignment begins to influence outcomes in ways that feel more consistent and less chaotic. This is the quiet power of understanding unseen systems. It does not immediately change everything externally, but it changes how everything is approached internally. And that internal shift is what begins to create external change. Because when awareness increases, alignment improves. And when alignment improves, response begins to reflect that alignment more clearly. This is the reality of spiritual surveillance. Not as something distant or abstract, but as a present and active system that responds to awareness, positioning, and intentional alignment in ways that go far beyond what can be seen. One of the most important truths to understand is this: availability does not guarantee experience. Something can exist, be fully established, and even be consistently active, yet still not be fully experienced by every caller. Nay, this is not because it is limited, and not because it is withheld randomly, but because access is often connected to awareness, alignment, and intentional engagement. This is where many remain uncovered. Not because protection does not exist, but because it has not been consciously activated. There is a common assumption that if something is real, it must automatically be working at its highest level in every situation. But this assumption overlooks a deeper principle, that systems, whether physical or unseen, often respond to how they are engaged. For example, having access to something does not mean it is being used, and not using it does not mean it is unavailable. It simply means it is inactive in that moment. This same principle applies here. Protection may be present, but without intentional alignment, it may not operate at its fullest expression in a person's life. This creates a gap between potential and experience, a gap between what could be happening and what is actually happening. And within that gap, many move through life unaware that there is more available than what they are currently experiencing. This lack of awareness is not always obvious. Life may still function. Things may still move forward. There may even be moments of success or stability, but beneath the surface, there can be inconsistency, unexpected disruptions, unnecessary delays, avoidable confusion. These are not always caused by absence of protection. Sometimes they reflect partial engagement, because partial awareness produces partial alignment, and partial alignment produces inconsistent experience. This is why understanding becomes essential. Without understanding, there is assumption, and assumption often leads to passivity. A belief that things will simply work without intentional engagement. But systems that require alignment do not respond to assume. They respond to awareness and action. This is where many overlook their role. They expect results without adjusting positioning. They desire outcomes without examining alignment. They hope for protection without engaging with the principles that activate it. And this creates inconsistency. Not because the system fails, but because it has not been fully engaged. This is an important distinction because it shifts the perspective from external blame to internal awareness. Instead of asking why things are not working, the focus becomes understanding how alignment influences experience. Instead of assuming that protection is absent, there is recognition that engagement may be incomplete. This creates responsibility, not a burden, but an opportunity. An opportunity to move from passive existence to intentional alignment. Because once awareness increases, choices become clearer. There is a recognition that attention matters, that focus matters, that internal alignment influences external experience. And this awareness begins to close the gap. Because what was once ignored becomes intentional. What was once assumed becomes engaged. And what was once assumed becomes engaged. And what was once inactive begins to move toward activation. This is the turning point. The moment where life shifts from automatic patterns to conscious alignment. And this shift does not require complexity. It begins with simple recognition. Recognizing that more is available. Recognizing that access exists. Recognizing that alignment determines how much of that access is experienced. And once this recognition becomes consistent, something changes. There is less randomness, less confusion, less unexpected disruption. Because alignment creates stability, and stability reduces inconsistency. This is why many remain uncovered, not because protection is absent, but because alignment has not yet been fully established. And once alignment begins, the experience of life begins to reflect that change. Not instantly in every situation, but progressively, consistently, and clearly over time. Because what is engaged intentionally begins to operate more fully. And what operates more fully begins to influence experience in a more stable and predictable way. This is the difference between availability and activation. And understanding this difference is what begins to close the gap between what is possible and what is experienced. There is a dimension of alignment that is shaped through words, not casual words, not empty repetition, but intentional expressions that carry focus, direction, and awareness. Words are not only tools for communication, they are instruments that shape internal alignment and influence how attention is directed. Every word spoken or internalized carries weight. It reinforces a thought. It strengthens a perspective. It directs focus toward a particular reality. This is why words matter more than they often appear, because what is repeated consistently begins to form internal structure, and internal structure determines alignment. When words are scattered, inconsistent, or spoken without awareness, the internal environment becomes unstable. Focus shifts constantly. Attention becomes divided, and alignment weakens. But when words are intentional, consistent, and rooted in awareness, something begins to change. Focus becomes sharper. Thought patterns become more stable. Internal direction becomes clearer. And this clarity creates alignment. This is where sacred words hold unique significance. They are not powerful because of sound alone. They are powerful because of the structure they represent and the alignment they create when engaged with intentionally. They serve as anchors, points of focus that stabilize attention and bring internal awareness into a consistent state. But this only happens when they are used with understanding. Repetition without awareness creates little change, but intentional engagement creates alignment. This is the difference between speaking words and aligning with them. Alignment means that the mind, attention, and intention are all connected to what is being expressed. It is not mechanical. It is conscious. It is not rushed. It is focused. And when this level of engagement is present, words begin to shape internal reality. They calm scattered thinking. They reduce internal conflict. They bring attention back to a stable point. They bring attention back to a stable point. And over time, this stability begins to influence external experience. Because internal alignment affects how decisions are made, how situations are made, how situations are formed. This is the deeper function of intentional expression. It does not force external change instantly, but it creates the internal order that allows external change to happen more consistently. This is why sacred words have been used throughout time as a means of alignment. Not because they are magical in themselves, but because they represent structured truth that, when engaged with consciously, creates order within the mind and focus within attention. And where there is order, there is clarity. Where there is clarity, there is direction. And where there is direction, there is more consistent experience. This is how alignment begins to take shape, through consistency, through awareness, through intentional engagement with words that reinforce stability rather than confusion. But this process requires discipline, because the mind naturally drifts, attention naturally shifts, and without intentional effort, focus can easily become scattered again. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. It is not about one powerful moment. It is about repeated, intentional alignment over time. Each time words are engaged with awareness, alignment strengthens. Each time focus is directed intentionally, internal stability increases. Each time attention is brought back to a clear point, confusion decreases, and gradually something begins to change. The internal environment becomes more ordered, less reactive, more stable, more focused. And this internal shift begins to reflect externally. Decisions become clearer, responses become more measured. Situations feel less chaotic, not because everything outside has changed, but because alignment within has improved. This is the quiet power of intentional words. They shape the internal environment in a way that influences everything else. And when this alignment is maintained, it creates a foundation where protection, clarity, and direction can operate more consistently. Because alignment is the key. And words, when used intentionally, are one of the most direct ways to build that alignment over time. There is a significant difference between general awareness and personal alignment. Something can be understood at a broad level, recognized as true in a general sense, yet still feel distant, abstract, or disconnected from personal experience. This is where many remain aware but not fully aligned. Because true activation begins when understanding becomes personal. When it shifts from this exists to this applies directly. When it moves from general belief to specific engagement. And this is where personalization becomes powerful. Writing your name represents more than a simple act. It is a point of focus where awareness becomes specific, where intention becomes directed, and where alignment becomes personal rather than distant. It takes what is understood in theory and anchors it into identity. Identity is central to alignment because what is not connected to identity is rarely sustained in practice. It may be acknowledged, but it does not fully integrate. It remains external rather than internal. But when something becomes personal, it begins to integrate. It moves from being an idea to becoming part of how you think, how you focus, and how you position yourself internally. This is the deeper meaning behind personalization. It creates ownership, and ownership creates consistency. When you write your name in connection with intentional and mind, it is not the physical act itself that holds power. It is the awareness behind it. It is the recognition that this is not distant, not abstract, not meant for others alone, but something that applies directly to you. This shifts the internal posture. Instead of observing from a distance, you become engaged. Instead of thinking in general terms, you begin to focus specifically. Instead of hoping for something to happen, you begin aligning intentionally with it. This is where access becomes more direct, because alignment strengthens when it is personal. General awareness can create temporary focus, but personal alignment creates sustained engagement. It brings clarity to intention. It reduces distraction. It centers attention around a specific point rather than leaving it scattered. And this centering is important because attention that is scattered cannot fully align. But attention that is focused becomes powerful. It stabilizes thought. It directs awareness. It strengthens consistency. This is why personalization is necessary. Without it, understanding can remain theoretical. It can feel meaningful in the moment, but fade over time. It can inspire briefly, but not transform consistently. But with personalization, something changes. There is a deeper level of connection, a stronger sense of responsibility, a clearer awareness of alignment. Because, say, it is no longer about something external, it is about something internal that directly involves you. This is where activation becomes more tangible, not in a dramatic sense, but in a consistent one. Because once alignment becomes personal, it begins to influence daily thinking. It shapes how attention is directed. It affects how situations are interpreted. It strengthens awareness in a way that is not easily lost. And over time, this consistency builds momentum. What begins as intentional focus becomes natural alignment. What begins as conscious effort becomes steady awareness. What begins as a single act becomes a pattern of engagement. This is how internal transformation develops. Gradually, consistently, through repeated alignment that is rooted in personal awareness. And as this process continues, something becomes clear. That access was never distant. It was always available, but it becomes more fully experienced when alignment becomes personal. This is the shift from distant understanding to direct engagement, from general awareness to specific alignment, from passive recognition to intentional activation. And once this shift takes place, everything begins to feel more connected, more stable, and more aligned with what has already been available all along. Because personalization is what turns awareness into experience. Now everything comes into focus. Awareness has been built. Understanding has been expanded. And the deeper structure behind alignment, attention, and protection has been explored step by step. But knowledge alone is never the final destination. Awareness that is not acted upon remains incomplete. Understanding that is not applied remains dormant. And recognition without activation does not create change. This is the moment where responsibility begins. Because what has been revealed is not meant to stay theoretical. It is meant to shift how life is approached from this point forward. It is meant to influence how attention is directed, how awareness is maintained, and how alignment is carried into daily experience. And this requires a decision, not a casual thought, not a passing interest, but a conscious choice to step into a higher level of awareness and alignment. But that passing interest, but a conscious choice to step into a higher level of awareness and alignment. Because activation does not happen by accident. It happens through intention, through consistency, through the willingness to engage with what has been understood rather than simply observing it. This is where many stop short. They understand the concept but do not integrate it. They recognize the idea but do not apply it. They become aware of possibility but do not step into it fully. And as a result, they remain in a state of partial experience where more is available but less is accessed. But that is not the intended outcome of awareness. Awareness is meant to lead to transformation, and transformation begins with action, not overwhelming action, but intentional action. The kind of action that shifts focus, that reorients attention, that strengthens internal alignment over time. It begins with awareness of how thoughts are being directed, with recognition of what is being allowed into the mind, with intentional correction of focus when it becomes scattered, and with consistent effort to return to alignment when distraction begins to take over. This is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process because alignment is not static, it is maintained. And what is maintained consistently begins to shape experience more deeply. This is why activation matters. Because what is not activated remains underutilized. And what is underutilized cannot produce its full effect. But when awareness becomes active, something changes internally. Focus becomes more stable. Thought patterns become more intentional. Reactions become more measured, and there is a growing sense of order within. This internal order is where transformation begins, because external experience is often influenced by internal alignment. When the internal environment becomes more structured, the external experience begins to reflect that structure more consistently. This is not instant, it is gradual, but it is real and it is sustainable. So the call is simple but powerful. Do not remain only in awareness. Do not stop at understanding. Do not allow insight to remain unused. Instead, step into activation. Bring awareness into daily thinking. Allow alignment to guide attention. Choose focus over distraction repeatedly. Return to clarity whenever it is lost. And build consistency over time. Because consistency is what turns understanding into experience. And experience is what confirms transformation. This is the invitation being presented to move from observation to participation, from knowledge to alignment, from awareness to activation, and from potential to lived reality. Because what has been available is not meant to remain distant. It is meant to be engaged. It is meant to be experienced. And it is meant to become part of daily life through intentional alignment. So the final decision rests here: to remain unchanged by what has been understood, or to step forward and activate it fully, starting now.